you have to say. But a few things. We've got some pretty big issues, obviously, going forward. Specifically, when we get back in September, you're going to have the Iranian agreement that's going to have to be considered by around September the 15th. That's certainly high on the agenda. Other issues you're going to be confronting, we've got to come up with a budget agreement. As a member of the Appropriations Committee, I can tell you that we need to bring about some greater budgetary stability. If we don't get a budget agreement, I do worry that we would go into a long-term continuing resolution, which is really not a very good way to fund the federal government. It's actually disastrous for a lot of programs, and certainly for the Pentagon, it's a complete fiasco. It's problematic for the VA. It's problematic for just about every in the federal enterprise, and so we need to provide some greater budgetary stability. So you're going to see probably work on a budget agreement, the debt ceiling, a long-term transportation bill, and what we call tax extenders. These could all be married up at some point, and they're going to be negotiated, I think, together. It might be voted on separately, but I can see this all coming together at the end of the year, which is going to make for an awfully difficult Christmas for some of us. And you can leave it to Congress to figure out a way to screw up the Christmas season. But so I'm a little concerned. But nevertheless, this is what we're going to be. This is what we're going to be dealing with. I'm hopeful that we're going to get to a long-term transportation bill. The key issue is how do we provide for a sustainable revenue source, and I don't see George Wolf is not in the room, is he? No, George is not here. But a lot of folks from Lebanon County and through South Central Pennsylvania have been talking to me quite a bit about the need for a sustainable 5-6 year transportation program, and that's the question is how do we pay for it? The Senate was just before we broke in July, they were going to send us a 6-year bill paid for 3 years, which wasn't well received, let's put it that way. And so we got another one of these temporary can kicks, short-term bill, and it takes for a few months up until probably the end of October. But that's not going to be good enough, and I think we're all tired of the can kicks. We want to do this long-term bill once and for all. And so stay tuned on that score. Ex-Im Bank, Export-Import Bank, an important issue. Particularly in light of the trade agenda, we saw the enactment of Fast Track, which is our Trade Promotion Authority, which is the formal name, which is really not a trade agreement at all, but simply a process to help you, where Congress provides the parameters and the guidelines as to what the administration is doing in terms of negotiating trade agreements. We set the objectives, and the administration is supposed to negotiate in exchange for those parameters and congressional input. The administration then is able to present the trade, whatever negotiated trade agreement would be coming to Congress, present it to us, and then we have to vote it up or down without amendment. That's the idea. There are 2 pending trade agreements: Trans-Pacific Partnership, 12 nations. Pacific Rim nations, it's U.S., Canada, Mexico, Peru, Chile, Australia, New Zealand, Vietnam, Japan, Brunei, Singapore, and I think I'm missing somebody. But nevertheless, it's 12 nations. And these 12 nations are it's a very big agreement. This is a difficult. Believe it or not, this agreement is not as difficult to negotiate as you might think. Easier to negotiate, harder to approve legislatively. There's a separate agreement moving concurrently, which is the U.S.-EU or the U.S.-EU trade agreement, or the what we call TTIP, Transatlantic Trade Investment Partnership. That, on the flip side, is a much more difficult agreement to negotiate, but it would be much easier to enact legislatively. It's seen as a trade agreement among equals, and that agreement is still out there. It's not moving as quickly, candidly, as the Pacific Agreement, but that is a very consequential agreement just as well. So stay tuned. That has its own issues, though. Negotiating an agreement like that, you're dealing with the French and the Italians, who have they have these geographic identifiers that they feel very strongly about. They feel like they own Bologna, Parmesan, Champagne, Brie, Gouda, that these are their terms and they don't like us using those terms. But it's a non-starter for us. You know, we tell them we have geographic identifiers too. You know, Virginia hams, Lebanon bologna, Lebanon bologna. You could have a long list. Philadelphia cream cheese, and we have our own. But you know, but the truth is, you're not going to be able to convince a Wisconsin cheese farmer that he's going to have to change his label to say something like that. We'll have to say this is you know, with Wisconsin cheese, it tastes like Gouda. I mean, he's not going to be able to do that. I mean, it's not going to happen. But so we're having these kinds of battles with some of the Europeans. We'll get through it, but there'll be a lot of drama between now and then. So stay tuned on the trade agenda. There may be some movement on tax reform. It'll be on the business side, not on the individual side. I don't see any great appetite right now to do an individual tax reform, but I think there's a general consensus both on the Republican side, and even the president agreed that the corporate rate of 35% is too high. The idea is to bring it down to something somewhere in the mid-20s. Now, if we do this, we're going to have to also deal with pass-through entities, which is what most small businesses are. We can't have a C corp rate, you know, for the bigger companies at a lower level than would be for the pass-through entities, which is largely small business throughout America. So that's kind of that's the lay of the land right now in DC. One final point on transportation. One paid for that's being looked at pretty seriously to fund transportation is this notion of repatriation. We want to allow for many of American dollars that are overseas to be brought back into the U.S. With a minor penalty. There's a major impediment to American companies bringing back their money because we don't operate on a territorial system that gets into tax reform. But the idea would be to allow a lot of that money to come back home, taking a portion of it for the highway trust fund. So that's being seen as a paid for, will be tied to again some kind of at least a limited tax reform. So with that. I just wanted to say that. Finally, so I mentioned the Ex-Im Bank. I know it means a lot to many people, and I never thought in my wildest dreams that the Export-Import Bank would become a defining issue. Frankly, if I were to go down Difficult Street in Lebanon or just about anywhere else in my congressional district and say, well, hey, what's your opinion on the Ex-Im Bank? Just approach somebody on the street, they say, oh, they might say, oh, you know, is that bank over in Hershey or something? You know, they wouldn't know. They don't know what it is. And it's really unfortunate that it has taken on this very bitter tone, because you know, when you get right down to it, you know, where a lot of Americans want to sell products in the developing world, especially where there's some growth, they don't have well-formed or any capital markets to speak of in some cases. And this is a critical component. This is a critical tool for us to be able to sell American-made products, and oftentimes big products. You know, locomotives, you know, major types of equipment. It's very farm equipment, for example. Very hard to sell this stuff in those parts of the world without it. Aircraft, clear another item that is sold. Ex-Im Bank financing quite a bit as well. So stay tuned on that little battle. That's also going to happen. I suspect the votes are there in both the House and Senate to enact it, but it's taken on a life of its own, and so I just wanted to throw that out there. With that, I thought I'd maybe stop right now and maybe just open up to your comments or questions on any issues.
On the deal with Iran.
Yeah.
Where might you stand, and if you happen to be against it, as most Republicans are, do you have some viable alternative, bearing in mind that they say they're only months away from developing a nuclear device if we don't enter into some agreement?
Yeah, on the Iranian agreement, look, I think here's my main concern. I've never been opposed to negotiating, to testing this guy, Rouhani, he became president just a couple of years ago. His rhetoric was more moderate than that of his predecessor, Ahmadinejad. We also know, too, that at the end of the day, the president of Iran doesn't make these major decisions. It's the Ayatollah Khamenei. And And the goal of these negotiations, in my view, has evolved and shifted. The goal for some time had been to prevent the Iranians from developing a nuclear weapons capability. It seems to me that that point has now been conceded, that the issue now is containment. And that was never the policy of our government. I'm not sure when it changed. In fact, I remember when Secretary and Senator Chuck Hagel, former senator, he was at his congressional or his Senate hearing for his nomination to become Secretary of Defense, and he was admonished by Senator Levin, who, when Hagel said, you know, our policy is containment, and Levin said, well, no, it's prevention. He said, I stand corrected. Well, actually, it really wasn't a gaffe. I think he was correcting what the policy was. So that said, I'm opposed to the agreement, but I don't think the alternative is simply war, as the president has suggested. I don't believe that for 1 second. We entered into these negotiations, we, the U.S., from a position of strength, where Iran was largely isolated diplomatically, and I think it's been unfortunate that that we seemed a bit more desperate for this deal than we needed to. The sanctions have had a real impact on the Iranian economy, and particularly since the price of oil has dropped, that has even aggravated, exacerbated the problem for the Iranians. So I guess what I would say to you is that we are in a position of strength. It's okay to walk away. The Iranians do need a deal. I'm not saying that we should never negotiate with them. I think we should, but I think it's okay to step back and try to force a better agreement than the one we have. Because I'm looking at the inspections regime, and they say 24 days is as soon as we can get in. I would argue it's going to probably be closer to 70 days. By the time you get through all the various traps and hurdles, it won't be a 24-day time period. It'll be 24, probably closer to 70 days. On the issue of the snapback sanction, we've been told that we have to enter into this agreement because some of our partners in Europe and in China and Russia do not want. They're tired of the sanctions regime. They're going to walk away from it. That's what they tell us. On the other hand, the administration tells us that. And on the other hand, we're told that should there be Iranian non-compliance with this nuclear agreement, then these sanctions will simply snap back. I don't buy that for 1 second. I think that the Chinese and the Russians have different objectives and goals than we do at this point, different interests, certainly the Russians especially in the Middle East. In fact, the Russians are already selling anti-aircraft. They've already agreed to sell anti-aircraft weaponry to the Iranians. And so I guess my quick answer is there isn't a great alternative at the moment, but it seems that our position should be that I would still ratchet up sanctions. Many of these countries that right now are saying they won't engage in further sanctions. I think there's a little bit of a bluff there. Many of our European friends need to do business far more with us than they do with the Iranians, and they all know it. So I think we have a bit more power and leverage than the administration is stating right now in these negotiations. So stay tuned. Again, this is not a great situation, but at the end of the day, it's not just so much what I think. This is really more a matter of what folks in that part of the world think. It seems to me that the Saudis are prepared to nuke up. They've already been in contact with the Pakistanis. There's a lot of speculation about the Turks and the Egyptians and maybe some of the other Gulf Arab countries that if our friends and allies are going to expect the same nuclear agreement that the Iranians get, that's an issue for us. And I would be very concerned about a new round of proliferation in the Middle East, in a region of great state instability and irrational non-state actors like ISIS, Al-Qaeda on this front, Hezbollah and others. So I think we have to, this is a very consequential agreement. And I think there are going to be some real ramifications for it. And it's not just, and the Israelis obviously are very much opposed, but I'd say you have to watch the Saudis right now, because I think there's going to be an Arab bomb coming out of this thing if we're not careful. Any other questions or comments on anything? Nope.
First of all, thank you as a board member for Friends of Old Anvil. Thank you for visiting Anvil earlier this month. And as the director of the new Sustainability Center at Lebanon Valley College, I was wondering if you could share your thoughts on climate change.
Yeah, I mean, my view on climate change, global warming is this, that, you know, I accept the fact that the Earth is, that I believe the Earth is warming. I accept that. But where I guess where I part ways with some of the folks on the climate change movement is this notion of a cost-benefit analysis. I don't believe that we need to look at this very seriously. That we have to weigh the domestic costs in terms of jobs, you know, investment. We have to weigh that very carefully. If we in terms of whatever policies we enact, what will that cost be domestically, and weigh that against whatever global CO2 mitigation benefit we would realize. And in my view, so far, I believe that these costs are going to far outweigh that benefit right now. And that said, you know, there are a lot of things we can do to help, you know, lower our carbon emissions. And I find it interesting because I've had the opportunity to go to Europe, and you know, I watched in Germany where they're accelerating the closure of their nuclear plants. And what they're finding is that they don't have enough capacity, and so they import French nuclear energy to replace what they were producing. And while they have a lot of solar energy and they're trying to get as much as they can out of solar and wind and other renewables, it simply isn't enough. So they're needing to they need more coal-fired plants, and so now their carbon emissions are going they're on the rise in that part of the world. And in the U.S., you know, we've had a different approach. Clearly, our coal plants are being closed in part because of very competitive natural gas prices, and also because of EPA regulations. And so you're seeing, you know, but the consequence of that has been that there's been a lot more, you know, gas-powered electricity that has come online to replace coal. Although I would argue probably not enough, because I think there are going to be some supply issues in our country at that point, that we're losing a lot more capacity than we're replacing it with. So, long story short, we're going to see but the gas, you know, has actually substantially helped lower our carbon emissions. So I guess that's my quick view of this, that we have to, you know, we have to do a very serious cost-benefit analysis of this thing, and make sure that these costs are reasonable and that there are actual benefits. And when you look at the developing world, I know the administration entered into an agreement with the Chinese, a non-binding agreement, that the Chinese are supposed to meet certain goals and objectives by 2030. But when I looked at the agreement, all the Chinese agreed to is what they had already offered. This is what they'd always been planning. It was nothing new. And again, it's a non-binding agreement, so I'm not sure just how effective it would be. Thanks for that question. Yeah, Jim?
If Republicans wants and business community wants some substantial reduction in corporate tax, and at least a temporary reduction in the tax to allow repatriation of foreign earnings, what's the administration likely to need on the other side to make that happen?
Well, the administration has said that they're prepared to take the corporate rate down. I think they've said 28%, they've said 25%. So at least we're kind of all moving in the same direction. The trick will be, you know, what the pay-fors would be. I think the administration would like to, they would like to use, I think as their pay-fors, some of the, I'll say, preferences for conventional fuels or energy. I think that's where they're going, which might be kind of tricky for a lot of, you know, obviously a lot of the producers, particularly now with the price of oil being lower. It may not be as helpful, but I should also let you know too, in fairness to the producers, they tend to pay closer to the statutory rate anyway, 35%. When you look at who pays that corporate tax, you hear about, you know, 1 year GE paid, a few years ago GE had no corporate tax liability. But a lot of the energy producers pay much closer to that statutory rate. So I think we have to be a little careful about this. We're talking about repatriated funds. And also, we're also looking at all sorts of tax preferences. I mean, I'm prepared to, believe me, I'm prepared to shut down preferences wherever they may be on the business side, you know, across the board if we have to, or at least limit those preferences. Limit them. In exchange for that, you get a lower rate. And that could be a whole host of preferences. There are about $100 billion worth of tax preferences on a given year on the business side in this country. You know, on the individual tax side, there are about $1 trillion worth. That's mortgage interest deduction, deductibility, state and local property taxes, and, you know, a whole host of things, charitable contributions. So I would tell you on the business side, I think it's a little easier to get to a tax reform agreement, just because you're dealing with a smaller number and a different number of preferences. And like the R&D tax credit, it's a good credit. But you know, if we had a real tax reform, you know, maybe we wouldn't need all the preferences, and we could limit many of these. And in exchange for that, you get a much lower rate. But you know, without a tax reform, you need things like the R&D tax credit. You do need it. So you know, this is going to be an open discussion on how to get to the lower rate. And I think we will end up butting heads with the administration on some of the.
So the idea was a simplified and more rational tax structure, basically.
Yeah. The idea is to simplify, limit the preferences, eliminate which ones you can. In exchange for that, you lower the rate. The more preferences you eliminate or limit, you know, the lower you can take the rate. That's the quick and dirty rule on tax reform, both on the business side and on the individual side. So, you know, and by the way, on the issue of on the repatriation, I mean, this is an issue for American headquartered companies that have overseas operations, and they make money over there, but it's hard for them to bring the money back because only the United States of the developed countries will tax the difference. So if you say Hershey Corporation builds a plant in Ireland, and they make some money, they pay the Irish government 12.5%. Nestle, their competitor from Switzerland, builds the same plant in Ireland, make money, pay 12.5%, they take the money back to Switzerland tax-free. Hershey would have to pay the difference between 12.5% and 35% to bring it back. So the tax code allows them to defer bringing the money home. So all these American companies, they keep their money overseas. They don't return it home. So my view is a good stimulus for me would be make it easier for American companies to bring money home. Now this has created a screwed up situation. That's about the most technical way I can say it. It's completely screwed up. You have a situation now where there are companies that are inverted, where they're being taken over. You know, American companies are being acquired by foreign headquartered companies. I'll give you an example. Medtronic's out of Minnesota, and Covidien, they're out of Europe. I think they're Irish based. Well, Covidien is going to acquire. The plan was to acquire Medtronic. And I said, well, why would they do this? Well, Medtronic wants to bring money back and invest it in the U.S. and Minnesota. They can't bring their billions of dollars back. It's just too costly for them. But if they become acquired by a European-based company, it's much easier to return their American money into the U.S. That's how screwed up the situation is. It's easier, and it's a sad state of affairs because of our very high rate, that we make it easier for an American company to invest back in the country if they become foreign headquartered. That's wrong. And that's what's driving some of these types of these inversions. And you hear people say, well, let's stop inversions. I said, well, the way you stop inversions is by getting a sane corporate tax code that has the rate that's competitive with the rest of the developed world, around 25%. And you move to a territorial system, tax foreign earnings. The U.S. should tax foreign earnings the same way most of the European countries do. And we would. My guess is a lot of these inversions would probably go away. They all wouldn't. They're not just doing this for tax purposes. There may be other real business reasons why you want to invert. But that's really an issue that we're going to have to address in a tax reform. Yeah.
What are you and your colleagues really doing in the issue of illegal immigration?
Excuse me. Yeah, on illegal immigration, I think we got to deal with it in about 5 or 6 parts. Clearly, the border security issue is top of the list. Although I would say that you don't need 2,000 miles of fence on the Mexican border. You can't build 2,000 miles of fence on the Mexican border because of the geographic challenges. You got gorges and gullies, and you just can't fence some of those areas. I've been down there. You need about, I still say you need about 700 miles worth of barriers on the border. And then you use sensors. You have to enhance, we've been enhancing our detention space. I'm on the appropriations committee. I'm making sure that we can maintain a capacity of about 35,000 beds for people that we apprehend. And then, of course, we've increased our Border Patrol complement, plus try to put the National Guard down the border wherever we can to supplement Customs Border Protection. So you do those things, but I'll tell you that by itself, the border security piece won't solve the whole problem. It's an important piece. Then you've got to deal with interior enforcement, and that's where it gets into these sanctuary cities, like in San Francisco, where interior enforcement does not work if there's not cooperation between ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, and state and local law enforcement. You've got to have that piece. And what they did out in these sanctuary cities like San Francisco, where the elected officials essentially prohibit or disallow their law enforcement from collaborating with ICE, it makes our job that much more difficult. You learn about this stuff, sadly, when there's a tragedy like that young woman who was killed with her father by a person who had been deported 5 times. The same situation happened in Newark a few years ago. 3 students were killed by a guy who was out on bail as a felon in the country unlawfully. So we need to obviously crack down on that. But we also have to fix the legal system of immigration. And here we are in Lebanon County. I mean, I love farmers out here, as you know. And it's not easy finding people, there are labor shortages in ag all over this country and across this congressional district. And so I need to make sure that we allow for reasonable caps. And we're going to have to raise some of the caps on some of the visa programs for, in the ag sector. I would even argue in some of the high skills sector. We're going to have to make sure that we allow people in lawfully, because about at least one third of the people in this country unlawfully entered lawfully. They came in legally, and they overstayed. And that also fuels more illegal immigration, because once you get in here, a guy says he's a seasonal worker, he ordinarily want to go home, but he can't go home now that he's here unlawfully because he can't come back in. So then they try to bring their families in illegally to reunite. So that's an issue that we've got to confront head on. Managing exit better. We don't manage it well. So you deal with that, and then so we're going to have to clean up the legal system, because if you don't clean up the legal system, people will find a way here. I mean, that's the reality. That if we make it too hard for people to enter legally, people will be here illegally. Some will sneak across the border, although we've done a better job there. But a lot of it will be legal entrance, not leaving, and then and we've got a mess. And by the way, I've mentioned this for your information, but about 1/3 of my staff's time, Karen, I'm not sure what it was when you worked in Congress, but 1/3 of my staff's time is spent on immigration matters. And you might be surprised what countries they come from. Syria, Lebanon, India, Philippines, China to a lesser extent. And that was always the case for my district in Syria, even before the Civil War over there. It was always the case. The largest Syrian population. It's not as much Mexico or Central America. We get some, but not as much. And I just wanted to share that with you. There's a lot of people trying to get in legally, and we have to make sure that we have reasonable paths for people to get in. And then we should also adjust our immigration system to reflect skills. Our immigration system is focused more on family reunification at this moment. About 2/3 family reunification, 1/3 skills. Some of our friendly competitor nations like Canada and Australia, they're just the opposite. They're 2/3 skills, 1/3 family reunification. We probably need to move more in that direction. I think that's what we ought to do. Then the final issue is, what do you do with at least 11 million people in the country unlawfully? I will tell you that we're going to probably have to, separate out these children who came here. The children are going to have to be dealt with, and my guess is most of them will become citizens. The children who came here no fault of their own, they know no other country, they will likely become citizens at some point. For the balance of the 11 million, I believe that there will be no special paths to citizenship. But at the same time, I do realize that deporting 11+